From New York, this is Democracy Now!
The resignation is the result that should happen, facing the people's demands. This does not mean he's a hero. It means that we are heroes. We achieved a victory, and we are continuing.
Lebanese Prime Minister Saad al-Hariri resigns after 2 weeks of massive anti-government protests calling for him to step down brought more than 1 million people into the streets. Demonstrators promised to stay in the streets until all their demands are met. Then we meet an unusual candidate for district attorney in San Francisco. Chesa Boudin.
My mother was sentenced to decades in prison. My father may never get out. My earliest memories are walking through steel gates to visit them. When I served as a public defender, I brought those experiences with me to the courthouse every day as I worked on behalf of the poorest and most overlooked residents of our city to ensure that people who couldn't afford a lawyer still had access to equal justice.
The primary race for district attorney in San Francisco is next week. Then a new documentary looks back to the 70s when constant fires in the Bronx displaced almost 250,000 people and razed an entire community. The Bronx was burning. But who was lighting the match? Decade of Fire tells the story.
We grew up with burnt out decay all over us. The South Bronx was burning down around us, and nobody seemed to know why.
All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. In news from Capitol Hill, Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman, the top Ukraine expert on the National Security Council, told congressional lawmakers that the White House transcript of a July 25th phone call between President Trump and Ukraine's president omitted key words and phrases. Vindman was testifying as part of the ongoing impeachment hearings into whether President Trump withheld military aid to Ukraine to pressure the Ukrainian president, Volodymyr Zelensky, to investigate Trump's political rival, Joe Biden, and his son, Hunter, who served on the board of Burisma Holdings, a Ukrainian energy company. Vindman told lawmakers the transcript of the call excluded an explicit mention of Burisma Holdings by the Ukrainian president, as well as Trump saying there were recordings of Biden talking about Ukraine corruption. Vindman also testified his attempts to include these omissions in the transcript failed. Today, lawmakers will hear testimony from 2 Ukraine experts who advised former U.S. Special Envoy to Ukraine, Kurt Volker. On Thursday, Democrats are slated to formalize plans for the public phase of the impeachment inquiry with a vote. Boeing CEO Dennis Muilenburg was grilled by Senate lawmakers Tuesday over Boeing's defective 737 MAX airplane, which was grounded worldwide after 2 crashes in Ethiopia and Indonesia killed all 346 people on board. This is Illinois Democratic Senator Tammy Duckworth.
Boeing has not told the whole truth to this committee and to the families and to the people looking at this. Yes, the pilots did exactly what they were supposed to do, but 5 seconds later, especially if that sensor is still stuck, it overrides what the pilot does and it pushes the nose right back down again. 3 seconds. A pilot's best friend is time and altitude. Yep. And on takeoff, there is no altitude, and he's got no time.
During Tuesday's hearing, Muilenburg admitted Boeing failed to provide pilots with additional key safety system information. While he spoke, family members of the Boeing crash victims stood up, holding giant photos of their dead loved ones. Muilenburg will testify to the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee today. The Justice Department is also conducting criminal investigation into Boeing. In Lebanon, thousands poured into the streets to celebrate Tuesday after Prime Minister Saad Hariri announced his resignation amid 2 weeks of massive anti-government protests.
First of all, we want to congratulate the people because the party of the people won today and not one party over the other, like in the past. The people triumphed over the political feudalism in the country. We will continue in our movement and in our uprising and our revolution to overthrow the money sharks that maintain a grasp over the country's joints.
Protester Abdullah Hammoud, the demonstrators are continuing to call for the resignation of the rest of Lebanon's ruling elite and the formation of a new government with independent experts. We'll go to Beirut for more on the massive protests after headlines. Anti-government protests are also continuing in Iraq, where tens of thousands of people marched on Baghdad's Tahrir Square Tuesday night, demanding the removal of the government. At least 225 people have been killed in the government's crackdown against the protests, which erupted earlier this month over corruption, mass unemployment, and the lack of basic public services. Al Jazeera reports Iraqi Prime Minister Adel Abdel Mahdi may soon be ousted after his two main political backers, Muqtada al-Sadr and Hadi al-Amiri, agreed to work together to remove Mahdi from office in response to the growing protests. In Haiti, anti-government protests have entered their seventh week as thousands of people again took to the streets of Port-au-Prince Monday to demand the ouster of President Jovenel Moïse. At least 20 people have been killed amidst the ongoing protests, which have also shuttered schools for 2 million school children across Haiti. In northern Syria, the Russia-brokered ceasefire between Turkey and Syrian Kurdish fighters expired Tuesday night, threatening to reignite fighting in the region. The Turkish invasion began after President Trump abruptly withdrew U.S. troops from parts of northern Syria, clearing the way for the Turkish offensive. Turkish President Tayyip Erdogan claimed today that Syrian Kurdish fighters had not fully withdrawn from the area near the Turkish border and said joint Turkish-Russian patrols would resume border patrols on Friday. The U.S. House of Representatives overwhelmingly voted to approve a resolution recognizing the mass killings of Armenians in Turkey from 1915 to 1923 as a genocide. The 405-11 vote declares it's now U.S. policy to commemorate the killing of 1.5 million Armenians by the Ottoman Empire as genocide. The issue has long triggered tensions between Turkey and Armenia, which to this day do not have diplomatic relationship. Max Blumenthal, editor of the website The Gray Zone, reports he was arrested at his home in Washington, D.C. on October 25th by a team of police in what he describes as an attack on the press. Blumenthal says he was arrested on a 5-month-old warrant for assaulting a Venezuelan opposition member during protest at the Venezuelan embassy in D.C. in March. Blumenthal denies the charges. He says he was held in jail for 2 days, shackled for 5 hours, and denied a phone call. In California, the National Weather Service in Los Angeles has issued a rare extreme red flag warning for Southern California as climate change-fueled wildfires continue to ravage the state. This is the first time the Weather Service has used the term extreme red flag warning, as winds up to 80 miles an hour threaten to spread the uncontrolled Getty Fire. California Governor Gavin Newsom declared a statewide emergency Sunday as wildfires spread from Los Angeles and Northern California, burning tens of thousands of acres and forcing the evacuation of over 180,000 people. And here in New York, about 200 protesters rallied at the headquarters of BlackRock Tuesday, calling on the investment giant to end its support for fossil fuels and companies driving deforestation. BlackRock is one of the world's largest asset managers with more than $6.8 trillion in assets worldwide. It's also one of the biggest investors in coal and oil. This is Reverend Kevin Van Hook of Riverside Church.
We are here this morning because we believe that the earth is not something that we've inherited from our past, but rather something that we are borrowing from our future. We're here this morning because we believe that our children their children and their children have a right to clean air. We're here because we believe that our children and their children and their children have a right to clean water. We're here because we believe that our children, their children and their children have a right to have a safe planet to call home. And we who believe in freedom for this planet cannot rest until it comes.
Tuesday's protest was held on the 7th anniversary of Superstorm Sandy, which blasted New York, New Jersey, and parts of New England with a record storm surge as high as 13 feet, killing 159 people and damaging more than 650,000 homes. A new study published in the journal Nature Communications warns up to 300 million homes around the world will be affected by coastal flooding within the next 30 years amidst climate-fueled sea level rise. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, DemocracyNow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Juan Gonzalez. Welcome to all of our listeners and viewers across the country and around the world. We begin today's show in Lebanon, where Prime Minister Saad al-Hariri has resigned after 2 weeks of massive anti-government protests. Al-Hariri said he had hit a dead end in trying to resolve the crisis and announced his decision in a nationwide televised address.
For 13 days, the Lebanese people have waited for a decision, for a political solution that would stop the deterioration. I have tried, during this period, to find a way out, to listen to the people's voice, and to protect the country from economic, security, and social dangers. Today, I will not hide it from you. I have reached a dead end. It is time for us to have a big shot to face the crisis. I am going to Babda Palace to present the resignation of the government to President Mishaoun and the Lebanese people in all the regions, in response to the will of many Lebanese who took to the streets to demand change.
Protests across Lebanon have brought more than 1 million people into the streets. They started earlier this month when the government announced a tax on WhatsApp calls. The demonstrations quickly grew into a call for a revolution with demands for the resignation of all top government officials, early parliamentary elections, and the creation of a transitional cabinet comprised of independent experts to guide the country through its economic crisis and secure basic services like electricity and water.
On Tuesday, many protesters welcomed the Prime Minister's departure but promised to stay in the streets until all their demands are met.
We will pursue our movement. The means are not clear yet, but we are continuing until all our demands are met, because this resignation is just one demand out of many others we want.
Lebanon has been on lockdown since the protests began. Banks and schools have been closed for nearly 2 weeks. Hariri's resignation Tuesday came hours after chaos broke out in downtown Beirut when a mob of hundreds of men stormed into the capital's main protest encampment, tearing up tents and setting some of them on fire. For more, we go to Beirut, Lebanon, where we're joined by Lara Bitar, an independent journalist who's co-founder of the Independent Media Workers Collective, Al Mursila. We welcome you to Democracy Now, Lara. I know there is a bit of a satellite delay. Can you explain to us the significance of the resignation of the Prime Minister demanded by the protests and what more the protesters are demanding?
Good morning, Amy. Good morning, Juan. Well, as you indicated in your report, the people on the street who have been demonstrating since October 17th, they've declared a general strike that lasted about 9 days. Schools and banks have been shut down for 11 days. So yesterday, after the announcement of the resignation, people were celebrating, they were congratulating each other, while at the same time acknowledging that the struggle is still very long. However, the general public is very uneasy with the situation right now because there's uncertainty in terms of the political and economic front. We're going through a severe economic crisis at the moment. Political parties such as the President's Party, the Free Patriotic Movement, and their supporters viewed this resignation as cowardly, as Prime Minister Hariri as relinquishing his duties and his responsibilities to the nation. But we just got word earlier that the current Lebanese president assigned Prime Minister Hariri to stay on as caretaker Prime Minister.
And what happens now, Lara? Will the president call new elections, or will there be an attempt to form a parliamentary majority government without elections?
This is what civil society organizations on the street are calling for. They're calling for primarily the formation of a new, completely independent government that is not represented by any of the political parties that are currently in power, and specifically not the political parties that participated in the 15-year-old Lebanese civil war. They're asking also for that independent government to have the ability to legislate laws including one to guarantee the independence of the judiciary, another law to reform the electoral law, and hold early elections to form a new independent government.
Lada, can you explain who the political elite is? The demand of the protesters that it's not enough for just Hariri to step down. They want the ouster of the entire political elite. And you just said that he has been asked to stay on as a caretaker. So does that mean he is not leaving?
It seems like, for the short term at least, that he's going to be staying in power. I just got news of this right now, so I'm not sure what the reaction on the street is, but I assume people are not very happy with this decision. I'm sorry, I couldn't hear the beginning of your question, but in terms of the ruling elite, these are different political parties, as they say, as demonstrators have been saying. These are people who, in essence, at the end of the Civil War in the early 90s, took off their military uniforms and replaced them with suits and ties, and they have been ruling this country since. So when people talk about, the complete overhaul and the complete and radical change of the political system, they are talking about these people. They are talking about the neoliberal economic policies that were implemented at the end of the Civil War, that people are really suffering because of these policies. They want to change the entire system, and they want every single political party or officials who have been complicit in the crimes that were committed during the war and post-war to be held accountable.
Can you explain the attack on the encampment by the men wearing black and the significance of this, what this protest encampment is?
So let me just very briefly talk about, just provide some context for your viewers. Since October 17, demonstrations have been nationwide from Tripoli in the north to Sur in the south. Demonstrations that took place in 2015 in the aftermath of the garbage crisis, demonstrations in 2011 against the sectarian system, and even demonstrations in 2005 that led to the end of the Syrian occupations. So occupation were centralized in Beirut. This mobilization is across the country. There's been almost 400,000 villages who have participated in some form of collective action. So while the attacks that happened yesterday generated a lot of media attention, there's been sporadic attacks all over the country by the state and its agencies, the security, the Lebanese army and the Lebanese intelligence, internal security forces, and affiliates or allies of the state who are keen on maintaining the current structure in place.
I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the growing wealth inequality that's at the root of many of these demonstrations and protests in Lebanon. After all, Hariri is one of Lebanon's richest people. He's worth about $2 billion, and it's been a tough week for world leaders who are billionaires. Over in Chile, Sebastián Piñera, another billionaire, is having massive protests in the streets as well against wealth inequality. How has this widening gap affected Lebanon?
So about 1% of the people in Lebanon control or hoard, I should say, the majority of the wealth. And in the past decade, that has incrementally grown. Since the beginning of this year, there's been also demonstrations because of recently passed austerity measures. There's been cuts to the only public university in Lebanon, the Lebanese University. There's been cuts to various ministries, such as the Environment Ministry, that is crucial to maintain as we're continue to face an environmental crisis. There's been additional taxes that primarily impact the working class and the poor. And we see, and also because Lebanon has one of the highest debt to GDP ratio at almost 150%, making Lebanon the third most indebted country in the world. So this public debt that is at almost $89 billion and continuously growing, the servicing of this debt primarily benefits the wealthy at the expense of the very poor. So there's a lot of anger on the street, and these demonstrations have somewhat been referred to by the international press as a WhatsApp revolution. That's far from the truth. WhatsApp was a very, very small trigger to what is happening here. They were also plans to not only add a tax of about 20 cents per day, amounting to a maximum of $6 per month. And also, for context, WhatsApp is used by almost everybody in the country, and especially because telecommunication costs are so expensive. So what we see is a gradual increase in taxes that do not really serve people who are being taxed, and tax evasion by the most wealthy and by the banking sector.
You mentioned more than $80 billion in debt. Who holds that debt? What countries are benefiting specifically, or what financial groups from the Lebanese debt crisis?
It's not really the international community that's benefiting. It's actually the local banking sector that benefits from the servicing of this public debt. And of course, some members of the international community, Saudi Arabia, Gulf states, and others. But for the most part, it is the local banking sector that is benefiting. And the local banking sector is very tightly affiliated or close to the political class. So they're in essence serving each other.
Can you talk about, you've described this as a really anti-capitalist mobilization. Can you also talk about how this dates back to, and what were the trash protests of 2015 that this has been building?
I'll just briefly talk about the 2015 demonstrations that were ignited after a garbage crisis that continues to be unresolved. And again, the primary difference between what is happening now and what is happening then, and even though in 2015 there was a lot of anti-capitalist sentiment that was expressed, we see it much more vividly today. One of the main protest sites is actually at the central bank. People have been there for almost 2 weeks. They are calling for not only the downfall of the current political class, but they're also calling for the downfall of the governor of the central bank, Riyad Salameh. They are also calling for the downfall of the rule of the bank in Lebanon.
I wanted to turn right now to Nasrallah to talk about his response to the protest, urging followers not to join the mass protests.
I want to appeal to the people. I want to appeal to the protesters and appeal to those who are blocking roads with all due respect, love, and fraternity to open the roads for the people to go to their works and schools and hospitals. I am scared for the country. We are scared for the country. We are scared that there might be someone who wants to take Lebanon and create social, security, and political tensions that would lead to civil war. Any solution, you, people, and political powers, and everyone related, you should base your actions on not falling into a government vacuum, a vacuum in the government institutions, a vacuum in the authorities. Why? Because this is really dangerous.
That is Hezbollah leader Nasrallah. Lara Bitar, the significance of Hezbollah around these protests.
So, on one hand, the Secretary General of Hezbollah goes on TV and tells his supporters to not participate in these demonstrations, while at the same time saying that there are legitimate concerns and that there are legitimate demands by people on the street. His supporters, however, sometimes do hear his calls not to act in any kind of violent manner. But then there's this claim that the Secretary General cannot always be in control of his supporters and of party members. But the attack that we saw yesterday, and it clearly turned out that it was primarily by Amal movement supporters and maybe a handful of Hezbollah supporters. We're not really sure, and we can't really know who is really sending these young men to attack these demonstrations. But what is very clear, at least from my perspective, is that Hezbollah, being part of this government, even if not as corrupt as other political groups, is at least complicit in the corruption that this government has been a part of for decades.
Early in the protests, a video went viral of protesters singing the children's song Baby Shark to soothe a toddler in a car that was stuck in the demonstrations. Baby shark, baby shark, baby shark, baby shark. The protesters in Iraq have also been chanting Baby Shark during anti-government demonstrations there. It's almost become the song of the movement in Lebanon. Lara Bitar, I want to thank you very much for being with us. Independent journalist based in Beirut, Lebanon, co-founder of the Independent Media Workers Collective, Al-Mutasila. When we come back, we speak to a candidate for district attorney in San Francisco, Chesa Boudin. Stay with us.
يكتم على نفس الأحياء منا وكذلك من مات فيها ما كناش قادرين نفتح بق في كلمة ولا في عيش ولا في جيش ولا قائد أعظم هنعوش ممنوع افتح بقك ممنوع ولا ترفع راسك ممنوع ولا تسأل روحك ممنوع يروح أمك افهم ممنوع حزن واحد مسموح يا دوب وانزل عن ذلك ممنوع ممنوع قمنا تعبنا وقرفنا وفجرنا وصرخنا قام السلطان مفزوع بما ان قام السلطان من صوت انا ربكم الاعلى
Marched with the people by the great departed. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
We turn now to a candidate looking to upend San Francisco's approach to criminal justice. Chesa Boudin is running for San Francisco District Attorney, and his resume is highly unusual. He's the child of Weather Underground activists Kathy Boudin and David Gilbert, who were in prison when Boudin was still a toddler. Gilbert remains in prison. Boudin was raised by former Weather Underground members Bill Ayers and Bernardine Dorn. Chesa Boudin has been endorsed by Democratic presidential candidate Bernie Sanders and is running on a platform of ending cash bail and dismantling the war on drugs. This is his campaign ad.
We live in a city built on a simple ideal. It's called equal justice for all. But for so many of us, this ideal is being betrayed. We've become a city of prosperity, but also of abject poverty. We've become a city of aspiration, but also of exclusion and inequity. Our most vulnerable residents do not receive the mental health care and shelter they need. We fill our jails with African-American San Franciscans who make up more than half the county's inmates, but only 5% of the city's population. We let the wealthy defendants go free on bail, even if they're dangerous, while the poor remain behind bars, even if they're innocent. I know what it's like to be impacted by the criminal justice system. When I was an infant, my mother was sentenced to decades in prison. My father may never get out. My earliest memories are walking through steel gates to visit them. When I served as a public defender, I brought those experiences with me to the courthouse every day as I worked on behalf of the poorest and most overlooked residents of our city to ensure that people who couldn't afford a lawyer still had access to equal justice. I'm part of a growing movement that's bringing a new vision to the district attorney's office. A vision to make the criminal justice system work for all of us, not just the rich and powerful. Justice demands an independent voice, someone willing to directly challenge a broken system.
Chesa Boudin is the newest addition to a growing number of public defenders who have vowed to use a local prosecutor's seat to end tough-on-crime tactics and restore civil rights. Over the summer, Tiffany Caban came within 55 votes of winning a tightly contested Queens district attorney seat against the Democratic machine's favorite candidate. The 31-year-old queer Latina public defender was supported by progressive district attorneys Larry Krasner of Philadelphia and Rachel Rollins of Boston, all part of a new decarceral prosecutor movement.
Well, for more, we go to San Francisco, where we are joined by Chesa Boudin. Welcome to Democracy Now!, Chesa. The election is just a week away. There have been unusual developments, and one of your main opponents has just been appointed the DA of San Francisco. If you can explain what just happened for a national audience, and also with your unusual history, why you want to become District Attorney of San Francisco.
Well, thank you, Amy. It's great to be back on the show. Thank you, Juan. Always good to be here. We are just under a week away from the election, and the election is November 5th. On October 18th, the current elected district attorney, George Gascon, stepped down in order to pursue the Los Angeles district attorney position. And it was a highly unusual development, particularly because this was the first open district attorney race in San Francisco history in over a century, quite literally the first time without an incumbent on the ballot since 1909. And when George Gascon announced his early departure on October 18th, the mayor immediately announced that she would be swearing in one of my competitors, Susie Loftus, as the interim DA for the 18 days until the election. It was a move widely criticized. The nonpartisan ACLU, for example, called it an interference with the democratic process. Many other observers jumped into the race to denounce this move as an effort by the mayor to tilt the scales of the election and influence the outcome. And of course, we have seen what everyone expected, which is that the interim DA has used her position quite literally every day to do a press conference or some campaign-related activity to draw attention to her otherwise uninspiring campaign platform.
And why you're running, Chesa Boudin?
Well, Amy, I'm running because I've seen firsthand, personally, my whole life, how broken our criminal justice system is. My earliest memories are going through steel gates and metal detectors just to see my parents, just to give them a hug. And I learned through years and now decades of prison visits that our justice system is not doing nearly enough for victims of crime. It's not rehabilitating people who have been convicted of crimes. And it's a system of racist mass incarceration that's actually costing taxpayers billions of dollars and making us less safe. I saw that, I lived it, I experienced it my whole life, and I decided to become a public defender to make sure that people had access to equal justice, no matter how much money they had in the bank. And day in, day out, practicing as a public defender here in San Francisco, I saw the same kinds of systemic injustices that I experienced firsthand as a family member of incarcerated parents.
Well, Chesa,
I fought day in, day out. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Amy.
No, I was going to ask you, Chesa, could you talk about some of the main planks of what you're hoping to accomplish as DA, especially in terms of sexual assault, immigration, mental health treatment, and also the racial disparities within the criminal justice system?
Absolutely. Well, thank you for bringing those issues up, Juan. They're actually all key platforms in my campaign. Let's start with sexual assault. I'm committed to testing every single rape kit, new or old, in San Francisco. I think if someone survives a sexual assault, has the courage to submit their body to an evidentiary collection process, it is incumbent upon law enforcement to at least test the evidence. My main opponent, the interim DA, was actually a defendant in a high-profile lawsuit because she refused to test rape kits when she was the president of the police commission. Mental illness is another critical issue in San Francisco. 75% of people arrested and taken to county jail in this city are drug addicted, mentally ill, or both. And we are currently using the county jail as the #1 provider of mental health services in the city. It's not working. It's not keeping us safe. It's not humane. It's not therapeutic. I want to treat mental illness before crimes are committed instead of waiting for people to be taken to jail. Racial disparities. San Francisco incarcerates African Americans at a rate that is higher than any other major city in the country. It's a disgrace. It's unjust. And we've got to systematically attack it. It is not enough in this day and age in a city like San Francisco to simply say we are being race neutral. As one of the leaders I'm proud to have as an endorsement in this race, Angela Davis, likes to say, we must be anti-racist. And those are the policies that I've developed, anti-racist policies to systematically root out racism at every step of the criminal justice system. It's a detailed program that will take an unflinching look at the ways in which racial bias manifests and attack it everywhere we see it, including implicit bias training on an annual basis, including a refusal to use evidence gathered by police officers with a history of racial profiling, of excessive use of force, or of dishonesty on the witness stand. And the other thing that's critical to my platform, absolutely essential, is putting victims first. We know that all too often in our criminal justice system, crime victims are used as pieces of evidence rather than given a meaningful voice in the process. I'm the only candidate in this race who is committed to requiring my staff to actually contact every victim of every crime within 48 hours to give them a voice. And I've developed the broadest, most ambitious restorative justice program of any jurisdiction in the country. As San Francisco's next district attorney, I will give every victim of every crime the right to participate in restorative justice if they choose to.
Chesa, you mentioned earlier on that one of your earliest memories was visiting your mother and father in prison. As you probably know, I was a classmate of your father's. We were both together at Columbia University and in SDS at the time. And I have always said that your father was, without a doubt, the most brilliant student at Columbia, at least at the time that I was there. I'm wondering, given their history, their imprisonment, how they are looking at your campaign and how that's affected how the voters are looking at you in San Francisco.
Well, Juan, I think all of my parents, despite the mistakes they've made and the consequences they've paid for those mistakes, are supportive and proud of me, and I think they're excited about this campaign. They certainly all worried that their mistakes and their history, things they did before I was even born, would be used to attack me in this race. And I think that was a concern they had. And I think they also worried that this criminal justice system we have is so oppressive and so punitive that it would be a very difficult challenge to reform it into a system that actually uplifts people, that heals the harm that crime causes, that prevents crime, instead of simply focusing on punishment. So they shared those concerns with me. I think probably the hardest of those conversations was with my father, your former classmate. I visited him at his prison last fall when I was considering throwing my hat in the race, and we talked about it in his prison visiting room. And he made the point pretty succinctly when he said that his cell block was already full, and he really didn't need more people being sent to prison. And of course, he knows, as I do, that we live in a society where prisons today are not obsolete, to quote again from Angela Davis's book. But we do have a need to protect society from people who are violent, and that is a role that jails and prisons appropriately play today. But it's a role that's really overused and abused, and we need to find ways to decarcerate, to safely allow people to return to the community, to have effective mechanisms for reentry. And I think my parents' concern was primarily that this is going to be a serious fight, and that people were going to attack me for things I hadn't done. And of course, their concerns proved to be accurate. The Deputy Sheriff's Association in San Francisco has spent over $100,000, much of it attacking me in this race, using my parents' history, using bizarre Red Scare tactics in a video put out by the John Birch Society to attack me. And just in the last week alone, the Police Officers Association here in San Francisco has spent over $200,000 in attack ads and mailers and TV commercials, making up lies, spreading misinformation, and using the kind of racist fear-mongering that has unfortunately been a hallmark of the tough-on-crime era of the 90s and early 2000s.
I want to go to the issue of the San Francisco's Deputy Sheriff's Association similarly opposing your candidacy, as you said, reposting this video from the John Birch Society titled "Terrorist Son as SF District Attorney" with a question mark. So how do you work with these groups once you become district attorney? And talk about the wave of this new generation of district attorneys across the country, from Larry Krasner in Philadelphia now, and the significance of you getting Bernie Sanders' endorsement, Chesa.
Thank you, Amy. Well, I'm proud to have been endorsed by, as you said, a wave of progressive prosecutors, people running for and winning offices around the country from coast to coast on a vision of making our communities safer by reducing racial disparities, by decarceration, and by holding law enforcement accountable. People like Larry Krasner, as you mentioned, I'm actually doing a campaign event with him tonight here in San Francisco. Tiffany Caban, who's been out here to campaign with me on the trail, and Rachel Rollins and Kim Foxx, who've both endorsed me in this race. In addition to those folks, and of course Bernie Sanders, who I'm tremendously honored to have the support of, one of the things that all those folks recognize, as do our rank and file law enforcement, and this goes back to the first part of your question, Amy, is that we are safer when we enforce the law equally. And all too often, in today's criminal justice system, the quality of justice that people receive depends not on guilt or innocence, but on the color of their skin, on how much money they have in the bank account, or on whether they wear a uniform to work. And so what I've learned and what I've heard over and over again from rank-and-file sheriff's deputies, from rank-and-file police officers, is that they are anxious to be liberated from the tyranny of the minority of officers who abuse their power, who abuse their uniform and their badge. Imagine being an officer on the beat and having a partner who violates the law, who plants evidence, who racially profiles, who uses excessive force and lies in police reports and testimony before the court. Well, if you're the honest officer serving alongside the dishonest one, and you do your job and follow the law and report the misconduct that you witness, absolutely nothing will happen to the officer who's committed misconduct. And you, for having integrity and decency, will be retaliated against and your career will be over. I believe that the majority of officers have taken their jobs because they want to serve and protect their communities. And their ability to do so is undermined, and their safety is put at risk by the tyranny of the minority. So I am excited to work with the majority of officers who have integrity, who serve with pride, who actually want to serve and protect their communities. But to do so, we need to make sure we're enforcing the law equally. I'm the candidate in this race who's made the clearest, most consistent commitment to do that, and it's exactly why the most extreme right-wing elements that run the police union have chosen to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars attacking me.
And the terrible crisis of homelessness, Chesa, you co-wrote an article in the San Francisco Examiner titled "The District Attorney Has a Role to Play in Protecting Tenants." On your campaign website, you vowed to prosecute landlords who break laws to exploit tenants. Can you talk about what this means and how you would deal with the increasing criminalization of unhoused people in the city? San Francisco has become really the poster child in this country of homelessness.
Amy, we have a real crisis of homelessness in San Francisco. You see it everywhere you go, and it's one of the issues that comes up with the most frequency on the campaign trail. Everywhere we go, people are asking the district attorney candidates, what are you going to do about the homelessness crisis? And of course, one of the first points we need to make always is that being homeless is not a crime. Being poor is not a crime. And yet, approximately 40% of our county jail is made up of people who were unhoused at the time of their arrest. Now, I'm committed to using data to inform my policies, to look at what the numbers show us and make policy based on data. So let's take housing as an example. 70% of the people who are currently unhoused in San Francisco were previously living in housing in San Francisco. So if we are committed to finding ways to reduce and address the housing crisis, we need to start by ensuring that people who are currently housed don't lose their housing through fraud, deceit, or illegal tactics by corporate landlords. Turns out that a huge percentage of the people who have been owner move-in evicted, OMI evicted in San Francisco, have been done so using fraud, deceit, or threats. Being a progressive prosecutor, Amy, is not just about decarceration, reducing racial disparities, and so on. It's also about making sure we are using the tremendous power and discretion of the district attorney's office to enforce the laws equally. That means prosecuting corporate landlords when they commit fraud. It means prosecuting police when they commit murder or perjury. It means prosecuting corporations when they dump toxic waste into our communities, as they did in the Hunters Point shipyards. And it means having a broader vision of using the district attorney's office to actually keep our communities safe, not simply wage a racist war on drugs.
Chesa Boudin, I want to thank you very much for being with us. San Francisco Deputy Public Defender, now candidate for San Francisco District Attorney. The election, the primary, is next week. When we come back, speaking of homelessness, speaking of losing homes, Decade of Fire. A new documentary tells the story of the terrible fires that ravaged the Bronx in the 70s and the community that fought to save their neighborhoods. Stay with us. I Never Listened to Them by Led to Sea. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
Decade of Fire. That's the name of a new documentary that takes us back to the 1970s, when the Bronx faced a near constant barrage of fires that displaced almost 250,000 people and devastated an entire area. The Bronx was burning, but who was lighting the match? Decade of Fire tells this story. This is the trailer.
We grew up in rubble. We grew up with burnt out decay all over us. The South Bronx was burning down around us, and nobody seemed to know why.
Everything south of the Cross Bronx Expressway, they just let it burn, and nobody gave a damn.
And all of a sudden, neighborhoods just went whoosh, gone.
Nobody's aware of the fact that we got a city dump right here in the backyard.
How could city government allow this to happen? Who was in charge? Why? The story we were told, the story the whole world was told, was that the fires were somehow our fault. But we didn't burn the Bronx. We were the ones who saved it.
I said, no, wait a minute. I have to make my move right now.
The reason we're trying to do all these things is to show an example to the rest of the people in the neighborhood that if you just try, you could make a lot better neighborhood.
If no one else wants to fight, we'll fight. And I'm sure that I could get all the women in the Bronx to go out there and fight.
The federal government can come in and wave a wand and do this.
We try to get money from the city to renovate a building. We got red tape, 2-3 years maybe. 2-3 years, there might not be a Kelly Street.
This story is not just about the Bronx. There are places like this in every major city in America. Places that everyone has given up on, except for us. We came from this so-called terrible place, but we would never leave it behind.
Decade of Fire airs next week on PBS, where for more we're joined by the two guests here in the studio who made this film happen. Vivian Vasquez-Irizarry is the film's co-director and co-producer. Born and raised in the Bronx, she describes her community burning in part through her own family's story. And Gretchen Hildebrand is co-director and co-producer of Decade of Fire as well. Vivian, let's begin with you. The poignant story of your family, and then what happened in the Bronx. Tell us that story.
So I grew up in the South Bronx during the 1970s. We had a great community. We thought it was normal. We thought it was natural. After we thought it, meaning the fires, right? Living in the destruction. That's how we grew up. As I got older, I began to realize that something was really wrong. And I began to work with young people and decided, let's teach history to young people about the Bronx and realized that, wait a minute, something was wrong. We were always told that it was our fault for the destruction of the Bronx. That's the narrative we've always been given, that it was the people of the South Bronx who burned it.
80% of the Bronx burned down?
80% of our housing stock was destroyed. And we also experienced 40 fires on average a day and night. You talk to people who grew up back then, and they will tell you they still remember the smell. And they still remember what they needed to do in case there would be a fire. Putting shoes out near the front door, maybe sleeping with your shoes on, maybe making sure that people in the neighborhood were always aware that any minute now there would be a fire.
And of course, many of those were arson fires that the landlords themselves set to be able to collect insurance money because they weren't getting enough income from the rents. And you also focus on the reduction of fire services to the community by the city government at the time of New York's financial crisis. Could you talk about that?
Yes, we talk about the fires, but we also reveal what led to those fires. And it wasn't that all of a sudden the Bronx began to burn. You know, we reveal that we experienced redlining, which really starved the community of resources to support buildings that were already pre-owned. They were already, you know, in bad shape. We talk about urban renewal, which crowded over 150,000 people into the South Bronx. We talk about the cuts of services, including firehouses. All of those factors led to the fire. So we characterize the fires as the vulture effect that occurred with policies that were made, humanly made, to the community beginning in the 1950s and 60s.
And when you talk about the 150,000 people that were poured into the South Bronx, they were being displaced from Manhattan as Manhattan was being gentrified by Robert Moses and Herman Badillo, and they were being pushed into the South Bronx, right?
Correct. Mm-hmm. We, you know, these people who were already poor became displaced into neighborhoods that created even a greater poverty effect for the community.
Let's go back to the documentary Decade of Fire.
We used to tell our landlord, don't abandon us because we can't live anywhere else. My children were all born here and we're trying to get our lives together and make something better for them.
The sense that I get, and there's this internalized sense of guilt and of shame for not being able and not working hard enough or not having what it takes to elevate oneself out of that circumstance.
We did blame ourselves because that's what we internalize. Wait, because we're living in it. Why are we doing this to ourselves? You know, it was complicated. And it's awful because I think that in many ways we still blame ourselves.
And another clip from the documentary Decade of Fire.
Our families were setting roots down here, but our neighborhoods were being targeted by government policies based on race.
It started with redlining.
Redlining, when this first starts in the 1930s, any neighborhood that has 5-10% Black or Puerto Rican population is seen as a declining neighborhood. The federal housing agencies, banks, insurance companies, they start taking maps and literally drawing lines around them based on which neighborhoods are good risk and which ones are bad. If a neighborhood had a red line drawn around it, it's a bad bet. Don't give a loan there. Don't give out homeowners insurance, fire insurance.
That was another excerpt from Decade of Fire. Gretchen Hildebrand, how'd you get involved in this film and why'd you feel so important to make it?
Right. Thank you so much for having us today. So Vivian and another co-producer of ours, Julia, came to me shortly after I had moved to New York. So I'm not a New Yorker, and I was really stunned to start hearing this story of what happened in the Bronx, and also felt really fortunate to be able to meet Vivian and begin to start working with her and her community, just sitting around talking about, what life was like in the, back in the 70s, and for positive and negative. And really, as we got further into it, I think one of our main goals with this was to try and break open policies like redlining and make them really accessible to people, because we really see a direct connection between those policies, that have been going on since the 1930s and the cities we live in today. And really wanting to give those, the policy, open it up to people as a tool, as a way to understand why we have such a crisis of displacement and gentrification in cities today.
And Vivian, I wanted to ask you, Charlotte Street and the South Bronx became the symbol of urban decay in the 70s and the 80s. Jimmy Carter went there, Ronald Reagan went there. They were all talking about rebuilding these areas. But people stayed, like you. Mm-hmm. And the renaissance of the Bronx right now is due to those people who stayed behind.
So in the film, you see the real creative resistance of people that stayed and fought and sacrificed their lives, everything they had, to save their building, their block, their neighborhood. You have people like Ramon Rueda from the People's Development Corporation who, automatically saw that we had the resource of human beings and empty buildings. Let's just bring those two together and figure out how we can rebuild the housing. You had the Potts family and, Robert Foster and Hope Foster, who together with folks from Banana Kelly decided that they were going to rebuild an entire block. You had women like Hetty Fox, who came from California actually after, visiting her father, and decided that she was going to stay and save her neighborhood and prevent her block from burning. Hers is one of the only blocks in the South Bronx that did not burn because she was there.
How are these residents being protected today?
So today, we're not experiencing the massive destructive force of fire physically, but the conditions of displacement and the threat of displacement in the South Bronx is grave. We are now, very afraid of displacement because of gentrification. So it's those same neighborhoods, and it's not just in the South Bronx, but if you look at all those neighborhoods across the country that were redlined and were, starved of resources back in the 60s and 70s, they're the same neighborhoods that are being gentrified today, and where people cannot afford to pay their rent, where people are being evicted, where people are being, harassed by landlords and are being forced to move out.
We're going to go to part 2 of this discussion after the show. We're going to post online at DemocracyNow.org. Vivian Vasquez-Irizarry and Gretchen Hildebrand, co-directors of Decade of Fire. The documentary airs beginning Monday on PBS Independent Lens. That does it for our show. Democracy Now! Currently accepting applications for paid 6-month internships here in New York. Go to DemocracyNow.org for details. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. Our website, DemocracyNow.org.